Hello everyone, welcome back to Insomnia Protocol. Tonight, we have another terrifying horror story for you. Before we start, please subscribe to the channel, hit the bell, and leave a comment below. Now, get ready, and let's dive in. Most of my weekends followed the same pattern. I would spend Saturday catching up on chores I had ignored all week, convince myself I deserved a break by lunchtime, then waste the rest of the afternoon scrolling through travel photos of places I kept promising I'd visit someday. By Sunday evening, I'd usually feel like I'd managed to do absolutely nothing despite being busy the entire time. One Tuesday after work, my sister stopped by with 2 boxes of old family photos she'd found while cleaning out our parents' garage. We ended up sitting on the living room floor for hours, laughing at faded birthday parties, awkward school pictures, and vacations none of us remembered quite the same way. Looking through those albums made me realize how long it had been since I'd gone anywhere without checking emails every hour. The next few days, I started browsing short-term rentals, mostly out of curiosity. I wasn't looking for anything fancy, just somewhere quiet enough to read, sleep in, and forget about deadlines for a couple of days. Every place either looked too expensive, too crowded, or suspiciously polished, with photos that felt more like advertisements than reality. Late Friday afternoon, an old college friend texted me after months of silence. He'd canceled a weekend reservation at a small cabin because of a last-minute work emergency. The owner didn't offer refunds, but the booking could be transferred to someone else. He asked if I wanted it before he let it go unused. The price was too good to ignore, and the photos showed exactly the kind of peaceful escape I'd been searching for. I accepted the transfer, packed a single duffel bag that evening, and the owner emailed me the check in details, mentioning there would be a handwritten note waiting inside the cabin. The owner emailed me the gate code, a parking spot number, and a short message that ended with, "Cell service comes and goes. Don't worry if you lose signal for a while. The island has always been like that." I didn't think much of it. Plenty of places along the coast had terrible reception, especially once you got away from the bigger towns. I threw my duffel bag into the back of my SUV before sunrise the next morning and grabbed coffee from the same gas station where I always stopped before road trips. The cashier recognized me from work and asked where I was headed. "Just getting out of town for a couple days," I said. "Lucky you," she laughed as she handed me my receipt. The drive took a little over 4 hours. Most of it was interstate, then smaller highways, then finally a narrow 2-lane road lined with marsh grass that stretched farther than I expected. The farther I drove, the fewer cars I saw. By the last 20 miles, I passed more pickup trucks than sedans, and nearly every mailbox leaned a little sideways from years of salt wind. I stopped at a small grocery store to buy things I'd forgotten: eggs, bacon, bottled water, sandwich meat, and coffee creamer. The woman stocking shelves reminded me that the nearest supermarket was almost an hour away. "Hope you got everything," she said. "You don't want to make that drive twice." I checked my basket again just to be safe. Outside, an older man loading fishing gear into his truck asked if I was visiting. I told him I had rented a cabin for the weekend. "Good weather for it," he said without looking up. "Just pay attention to the tides." I figured he meant because of the access road. Coastal locals always knew things tourists didn't. I thanked him and kept driving. About 20 minutes later, I reached a weathered wooden sign with the island's name carved into faded blue paint. A single road led toward the water where a narrow strip of pavement crossed the marsh. There wasn't a bridge in the usual sense. It looked more like an elevated causeway that barely sat above sea level. Water stretched on both sides, calm enough to reflect the clouds. Halfway across, I slowed down to let a maintenance truck pass in the opposite direction. The driver lifted 2 fingers from the steering wheel in a casual wave. I waved back. On the other side, the island was smaller than I'd imagined. A handful of cottages sat scattered among wind-bent trees, with a tiny general store near the entrance and a marina with only a few boats tied to floating docks. It felt quiet without feeling abandoned. People lived there. Laundry hung behind one house. Someone was mowing a lawn. 2 kids rode bicycles down the road, arguing about whose turn it was to carry a fishing net. It looked exactly like the kind of place where nothing exciting ever happened. The cabin was another mile farther down a gravel lane that curved through tall beach grass. It wasn't luxurious, but it was clean. Gray siding, green shutters, a small wooden porch, and a rocking chair that squeaked every time the wind nudged it. I parked, stretched my legs, and unlocked the front door using the keypad code from the email. The inside smelled faintly of cedar and old books. Whoever owned the place clearly took care of it. There were framed photographs of the shoreline through different seasons, shelves filled with paperback novels, and a stone fireplace that probably hadn't been used since winter. My first instinct was to check the refrigerator, the thermostat, and whether the coffee maker actually worked. Everything did. A folded envelope rested on the kitchen table with my first name written across the front in black ink. Beside it sat a brass key attached to a wooden tag that simply read storage. I smiled because I assumed the owner had left recommendations for restaurants or hiking trails. I dropped my keys beside the envelope, but decided to unpack first. After driving all morning, I wanted to settle in before reading anything. I carried my bag into the bedroom, hung a couple of shirts in the closet even though I'd only be there for 2 nights, then laughed at myself for pretending I was staying longer. Old habits. Once everything was put away, I opened the blinds over the kitchen sink. The water shimmered in the distance beyond a strip of dunes. It was exactly the peaceful view I'd hoped for. My phone buzzed with one last bar of service. My sister had texted to ask if I'd made it. I sent back a picture of the porch with the caption, "Already worth the drive." The message took almost a full minute to send before finally disappearing. A few seconds later, the signal vanished completely. I shrugged and slipped the phone into my pocket. Honestly, being unreachable for 48 hours sounded more relaxing than inconvenient. Around mid-afternoon, I walked down to the marina. The general store sold sandwiches, sunscreen, fishing bait, and souvenirs with the island's name printed on mugs and t-shirts. I bought an iced tea and chatted with the teenage cashier who said summer weekends were usually busier than this. "You picked a quiet one," she said. "That's what I was hoping for," I replied. An older couple sat outside eating ice cream while watching gulls circle above the docks. A fisherman cleaned his catch at a station near the water, humming to himself. Everything felt ordinary in the best possible way. I spent another hour wandering along marked paths that led through dunes and patches of wildflowers. The ocean breeze carried that familiar mix of salt and seaweed. Every now and then I heard laughter from houses hidden behind trees, but otherwise the island seemed wrapped in its own slow rhythm. By the time I headed back toward the cabin, the afternoon light had started turning golden. As I passed one of the neighboring cottages, a woman watering flowers smiled and asked if I was renting the Ellis cabin. I nodded. "First time," she asked. "Yeah, nice place. Been there forever." She hesitated just long enough for me to think she was about to recommend a restaurant or a beach. Instead, she smiled again and said, "Enjoy the quiet while you've got it." Then she went back to watering her flowers as though she'd simply commented on the weather. I continued walking without giving it another thought. Back inside the cabin, I finally remembered the envelope still sitting on the kitchen table exactly where I'd left it. I made myself a sandwich first, opened a bottle of iced tea from the fridge, and sat down across from it. The envelope was thicker than I'd expected, like it held several folded pages instead of one welcome note. I ran my thumb under the flap, pulled out the papers inside, and unfolded the first sheet. The opening line wasn't a list of nearby attractions or checkout instructions. It read, in neat handwriting, "If this is your first stay here, there are a few things that will make your visit much easier." I frowned, leaned back in my chair, and kept reading. I read the first line twice because it sounded more like something a careful host would write than anything unusual. The paper itself looked old, not yellow with age, but softened around the edges like it had been folded and unfolded hundreds of times. The handwriting was neat enough to belong to someone who still paid bills by check instead of online. Underneath the introduction, the first paragraph wasn't a rule at all. It simply explained that the island operated on the tides more than the clock. Deliveries, maintenance, even the mail sometimes depended on the water. That made sense. I'd driven across the causeway myself. Then I noticed a sentence written in slightly darker ink, almost as if it had been added later. "If you're planning to walk the beach, always head back before you notice the water pulling away." I frowned. That sounded overly cautious, but coastal currents could be dangerous. Maybe tourists had wandered too far onto exposed sandbars before. I shrugged and kept reading, but the rest of the page was missing. The bottom edge looked as though it had been cleanly torn away. I flipped through the other sheets, expecting to find the continuation, but they weren't in order. One page talked about where to leave the key when checking out. Another listed the Wi-Fi password with a note saying it worked better in the living room than the bedroom. One sheet had only 3 handwritten lines before stopping in the middle of a sentence. I assumed the owner had accidentally mixed old notes with new ones. It wasn't exactly the polished welcome packet I'd seen in vacation rentals before, but it had character. I gathered the pages back together and slid them into the envelope. I'd sort through them later. The sun was still high enough that I decided to take one more walk before dinner. The beach behind the cabin stretched for what felt like miles in both directions. There were only a handful of people out. A father helped his son untangle a fishing line near the rocks. A woman walked 2 golden retrievers that kept chasing gulls without ever getting close. Farther down, someone sat in a folding chair reading a paperback with a cooler beside them. It was exactly the kind of peaceful scene people framed as desktop wallpapers. I wandered without checking the time. Every few minutes I'd stop to pick up a shell or watch tiny crabs disappear into holes no bigger than a quarter. The air smelled clean, and for the first time in months I realized I hadn't thought about work in over an hour. That alone felt worth the trip. Eventually I noticed a man standing near a weathered post where the sand met the dunes. He looked to be in his late 60s with a faded baseball cap and rubber boots that had seen better days. He wasn't fishing or taking pictures. He was just staring out toward the water with his hands in his pockets. As I walked past, he nodded. "You renting Ellis's place?" he asked. I laughed. "Is it that obvious? Only cabin around here people rent every weekend." "Nice place, it is." He looked back toward the ocean before adding, "Don't lose track of the tide." I smiled. "You're the second person who's told me that today. Then maybe it's worth remembering." His tone wasn't dramatic. If anything, it was matter of fact, the way someone reminds a stranger to lock their car. Before I could ask anything else, he tipped his cap and headed toward the parking area. I stayed another 15 minutes before deciding I was hungry. Walking back, I realized the beach already looked slightly different than it had when I'd come down. The wet sand stretched farther from the dunes now, and little pools of seawater reflected the evening sky. I couldn't honestly say whether the tide had started going out or if I simply hadn't paid attention earlier. Either way, I found myself remembering the handwritten sentence from the note, "Always head back before you notice the water pulling away." It wasn't hard to follow advice that already matched what I planned to do. I returned to the cabin, kicked off my shoes on the porch, and cooked bacon and eggs because I'd bought groceries and didn't feel like driving back to the general store. While dinner sizzled in the pan, I found an old battery-powered radio in one of the kitchen cabinets. It still worked. A local station played classic rock between weather reports and announcements about a church fundraiser happening on the mainland the following weekend. Everything about the place felt comfortably behind the times. After eating, I washed my plate immediately out of habit and carried a mug of coffee onto the porch. The island grew quiet faster than my neighborhood back home ever did. By 9 o'clock I couldn't hear traffic, distant sirens, or airplanes. Just wind moving through the grass and waves rolling in somewhere beyond the dunes. It should have been relaxing. It mostly was. There was just something about the silence that made every small sound stand out. A porch hinge creaked. Somewhere down the road a screen door slammed once, then nothing for several minutes. I went back inside when the mosquitoes started finding me. The living room felt cozy under the warm yellow lamps. I reached for the envelope again, thinking I'd organize the pages into the right order. This time another handwritten line caught my attention near the top of a different sheet. "Before you go to bed tonight." The rest of the sentence had been folded underneath another page. I unfolded it carefully. "Count the windows." I actually laughed. "What?" I said out loud to an empty room. I looked around. There were 2 windows in the living room, one above the kitchen sink, one in the bedroom, and a small one in the bathroom. 5. Maybe the owner was making sure guests locked them all before sleeping. That was a little eccentric, but harmless. I set the papers down without reading further. I still wasn't interested in spending my vacation studying someone else's handwritten instructions. Instead, I found an old mystery novel from the bookshelf, stretched out on the couch, and read until my eyes grew heavy. Around 10:30 I stood up, locked the front door out of routine, turned off the porch light, and walked through the cabin switching off lamps one by one. As I reached the bedroom, I caught myself glancing toward the nearest window. 5, I thought. Living room, kitchen, bedroom, bathroom. 5. I smiled at how ridiculous it felt to even remember that line. Even so, before climbing into bed, I walked through the cabin one more time and counted them again. 5. Satisfied for reasons I couldn't explain, I turned off the last light and lay down, listening to the steady rhythm of the ocean somewhere beyond the darkness. I woke up to sunlight pouring through the bedroom window, and for a few seconds I forgot where I was. Then I heard gulls outside instead of traffic, smelled salt in the air, and remembered the cabin. I slept better than I had in months. No buzzing phone. No neighbors upstairs dragging furniture across the floor. Just uninterrupted sleep. I made coffee, fried the rest of the bacon, and carried my breakfast onto the porch. A couple of cyclists passed on the gravel road and waved. One of them slowed down just long enough to ask if I'd seen the sunrise. I admitted I'd slept through it. Worth getting up early tomorrow, he said before catching up with his friend. After breakfast, I grabbed my camera and decided to spend the day exploring the island properly. There wasn't much to it. A few dirt roads, scattered cottages, a marina, and miles of shoreline. That was exactly why I'd chosen the place. Nobody seemed in a hurry. The woman at the general store remembered me from the day before and asked if the cabin had everything I needed. Everything's great, I told her. Owner left a pretty detailed welcome packet. She smiled politely. Sounds like him. You've met him a few times. She shrugged. Doesn't come out here much anymore. Before I could ask why, another customer stepped up behind me carrying a bag of ice, and the conversation ended naturally. I spent most of the morning walking trails through the dunes, stopping whenever I found a good view of the water. The island felt different during daylight. Less isolated. More like a sleepy vacation town that had somehow escaped commercial development. Around noon, I found a bench overlooking the marsh and ate the sandwich I'd packed from the cabin. A man in chest waders crossed the shallow water carrying a bucket of clams. We exchanged a quick hello. Nothing about the day hinted that there was anything unusual about the island at all. By mid-afternoon, clouds rolled in from offshore, cooling the air enough that walking became comfortable again. I wandered back toward the beach behind the cabin, with no real destination in mind. The tide was high when I arrived. Waves reached almost to the dunes before sliding back into the ocean. I sat on a piece of driftwood, taking pictures of pelicans diving for fish. Time slipped by without me noticing. I wasn't watching the ocean. I was watching birds, adjusting camera settings, and occasionally checking photos I'd already taken. Eventually, I stood up to stretch my legs. Something looked different. It took me a second to realize what it was. The waterline wasn't where it had been a few minutes earlier. It seemed farther away. Not dramatically, just enough that darker strips of wet sand had appeared where waves had covered them before. I remembered the handwritten sentence from the note. Always head back before you notice the water pulling away. Guess that's now, I muttered to myself. I wasn't scared. Honestly, I still assumed the owner was simply overemphasizing basic tide safety. I'd heard enough stories about tourists getting stranded on sandbars to know it happened. I turned toward the cabin without another thought. Halfway back, I noticed someone farther down the shoreline. A woman in a bright blue jacket was walking in the opposite direction, toward the widening stretch of beach. She looked to be in her 50s and carried a small metal detector over one shoulder. We were still 50 yards apart when I raised a hand. Afternoon. She smiled. Finding anything? I asked. She lifted a handful of bottle caps and laughed. Mostly trash. We kept walking. Neither of us stopped. I glanced back once after passing her. She continued toward the water while sweeping the detector across the sand. I reached the cabin a few minutes later, kicked the sand off my shoes on the porch, and went inside. The place felt noticeably cooler than outside. I poured myself a glass of water and opened the folded pages again. This time I tried arranging them by handwriting rather than page order. It became obvious they weren't one complete letter. Some sheets had newer ink. Others looked older. A few appeared to have been rewritten entirely. It was as if the owner had kept editing the instructions over several years and accidentally left every version in the same envelope. One page mentioned checking out before 10 in the morning. Another referred to replacing batteries in flashlights stored beneath the kitchen sink. Then I found the sentence I'd noticed the night before. Before you go to bed tonight, count the windows. Underneath it, written in smaller letters, was another line. If the number changes, don't try to figure out why. I frowned. That was oddly specific. Maybe it was someone's attempt at humor. Vacation rentals sometimes had quirky guest books and fake ghost stories to entertain visitors. I flipped the page over expecting a punchline. There wasn't one. Instead, the handwriting stopped halfway through another sentence, as though whoever wrote it had been interrupted. I set the papers aside again. They were becoming more confusing the longer I looked at them. The rest of the afternoon passed quietly. I read on the porch for an hour, dozed off in the rocking chair, then woke when a delivery truck drove slowly down the gravel road. Around sunset, I started making pasta in the tiny kitchen. While the water boiled, I looked through the living room window and noticed the woman with the metal detector walking back along the beach. She wasn't carrying it anymore. At first, I assumed she'd folded it up. Then I realized both of her hands were empty. Maybe she'd left it in her car. It wasn't my business. She disappeared behind the dunes before I gave it another thought. Night settled over the island quickly. I cleaned the dishes, turned on the radio, and listened absent-mindedly while reading another chapter of my book. Outside, the wind had picked up just enough to make the porch chair tap softly against the wall every few minutes. Around 10, I stood stretched and started my bedtime routine. I locked the front door, checked that the stove was off, and switched off the lamps. Just before stepping into the bedroom, I remembered the note almost by accident. "Count the windows," I said quietly, shaking my head. I walked through the cabin anyway. 2 in the living room, 1 above the kitchen sink, 1 in the bathroom, 1 in the bedroom. 5. Same as last night. I smiled to myself. Happy now. I said to nobody in particular and climbed into bed. Sometime after midnight, I woke without knowing why. The cabin was completely silent. Even the wind seemed to have stopped. I lay there staring at the dark ceiling, waiting for whatever had disturbed my sleep to happen again. After nearly a minute, I heard it. 3 slow knocks echoed somewhere outside the cabin. Not loud, just deliberate. Knock, knock, knock. Then silence returned. I held my breath listening, unsure whether someone had come to the wrong cabin or whether the sound had only been an old branch shifting in the night. I waited for another knock. None came. Eventually, I convinced myself I'd imagined it, rolled onto my side, and closed my eyes, unaware that the first quiet crack in an otherwise ordinary weekend had finally appeared. I didn't mention the knocking to anyone the next morning because, honestly, it barely seemed worth bringing up. Cabins made noise. Trees rubbed against siding. Wood expanded and settled overnight. I'd spent enough time convincing myself it had been nothing that I almost forgot about it while making coffee. The only reason it came back to me was because I noticed the folded pages still sitting on the kitchen table exactly where I'd left them. I carried my mug over, unfolded the same sheet, and found myself reading more carefully than I had before. The handwriting wandered between neat and hurried, as if parts had been written weeks apart. Near the bottom of one page, squeezed into the margin, was a sentence that hadn't caught my eye before. If someone knocks after sunset, make sure it's someone you're expecting before you even think about opening the door. There was no explanation underneath it, no dramatic warning. Just that single sentence. I smiled to myself. Guess you had a persistent door-to-door salesman once, I muttered. I folded the page shut again. The island had already started feeling familiar. That was probably why the note seemed less serious every time I read it. After breakfast, I drove back toward the marina. Low tide had exposed wide stretches of mud in the marsh, and several small boats leaned slightly where the water had receded. Fishermen worked without appearing concerned. A man sprayed down crab traps while another repaired a net beside the dock. Life continued exactly as it had yesterday. I wandered into the general store for another coffee and a newspaper that was already 2 days old. The cashier looked up from restocking candy bars. "Sleep okay?" she asked. "Best I've slept in months. That's usually how it goes out here." She handed me my change. Quiet has a way of catching up with people. Except somebody was knocking around last night. I said it casually, expecting her to blame raccoons or branches. Instead, she paused for half a second. "Wind carries sounds funny over the water." Then she smiled again, but it looked practiced this time. Probably someone at another cabin. That answer should have settled it. Instead, it felt strangely incomplete, mostly because she seemed eager to end the conversation. An older customer stepped beside me carrying milk and fishing hooks. "You staying down near Ellis's place?" he asked. I nodded. "Nice view over there." "Yeah." He looked toward the windows before speaking again. "Storm's supposed to stay offshore tonight." "Good. Means you'll probably hear farther than usual." I waited for him to explain what that meant. He didn't. He paid for his groceries and walked out. I watched him climb into an old pickup before heading back outside myself. The weather couldn't have been better. Bright sun, steady breeze, barely any humidity. I spent the afternoon doing exactly what I'd intended when I booked the trip. Absolutely nothing productive. I read on the porch, took another walk, skipped rocks into shallow water, and even considered extending my stay if the cabin happened to be available another night. Around 4 o'clock, I noticed something odd while walking the beach. Not frightening, just odd. A trail of footprints crossed a wide section of dry sand about 100 yards away. At first, I assumed someone had been out early that morning. Then I realized the prints began in the middle of open beach. There were no tracks leading toward them from the dunes. They simply started. I stopped walking. Maybe the tide had erased part of them. That made sense. It had to. I crouched for a better look. The sand around the first footprint looked perfectly smooth. Wind hadn't disturbed it. There weren't any bird tracks crossing it either. Just one clear print, then another continuing toward the shoreline. I actually took a step forward, curious more than anything else. Then another memory surfaced from the scattered pages. Never follow footprints that begin on dry sand. I sighed. Seriously. I looked at the prints again. My logical side immediately started inventing explanations. Maybe someone had jumped from a driftwood log. Maybe another person had brushed away earlier tracks. Maybe I simply couldn't see where they began. Even so, I found myself losing interest. Whatever the explanation was, I suddenly didn't feel like investigating anymore. I turned away and continued walking in the opposite direction. 10 minutes later, I glanced back. The footprints were too far away to make out clearly, but I caught myself feeling relieved that I hadn't bothered. Back at the cabin, I showered, changed into clean clothes, and started dinner while the evening light faded outside. I checked my phone out of habit. Still no service. I wasn't surprised anymore. I found an old deck of cards in one of the drawers and wasted an hour teaching myself a solitaire variation I'd forgotten years ago. It was almost relaxing enough to make me forget the strange note entirely. Then, just after sunset, someone knocked on the front door. 3 slow knocks. Not loud. Not aggressive. Just enough to be heard anywhere inside the cabin. I looked up from the table. My first thought was that maybe one of the neighbors needed something. My second thought was the sentence I'd read that morning. Make sure it's someone you're expecting before you even think about opening the door. I wasn't expecting anyone. I stood anyway. Hello, I called through the door. No answer. Another 3 knocks. Exactly the same spacing as before. I walked closer until I was only a few feet away. The porch light cast a faint glow through the frosted glass beside the door, but I couldn't make out a person standing there. Can I help you? I asked. Silence. I almost reached for the lock. Then I stopped. Whoever it was hadn't spoken a single word. They hadn't identified themselves or asked for anything. They had only knocked. I waited another 30 seconds. Eventually, I heard footsteps on the wooden porch. Slow. Unhurried. They moved past the front windows and continued around the side of the cabin until I couldn't hear them anymore. I stayed where I was for another full minute before finally switching off the porch light and stepping away from the door. My heart wasn't racing. Not yet. Mostly I felt annoyed. Kids pulling a prank seemed more believable than anything else. Still, I found myself picking up the folded note again. This time I didn't skim it. I searched until I found another unfinished sentence near the bottom of a different page. If you weren't expecting anyone. The page ended there, torn cleanly across the middle. I turned it over. Nothing. The rest was missing. For the first time since arriving on the island, I wished the owner had organized his handwritten notes instead of leaving me to piece them together like a puzzle. Outside, the wind picked up again, carrying the distant sound of waves across the dark beach. Then, from somewhere beyond the porch, I heard footsteps once more, not approaching the front door this time, circling the cabin, slow enough that I couldn't tell whether there was one person outside or several. I stood perfectly still in the middle of the living room, listening as they completed one quiet lap around the house before disappearing into the night. I stood there for another minute after the footsteps faded, waiting to hear them come back. Nothing. Just the steady creak of the rocking chair outside as the wind pushed it back and forth. I checked the lock one more time before convincing myself to leave it alone. Every instinct told me to pull back the curtain and see who had been out there, but something about the note lingered in the back of my mind. It hadn't actually told me to look outside. It had only mentioned making sure I knew who was knocking before opening the door. Since I clearly didn't, I decided the smartest thing I could do was go to bed and laugh about it in the morning. It took much longer than I expected to fall asleep. Every little sound seemed louder than it had the night before. The refrigerator compressor turning on made me glance toward the kitchen. A loose branch brushed the roof once. Somewhere in the distance, a gull cried out even though it had to be well after midnight. Eventually, exhaustion won. When I opened my eyes again, pale sunlight filled the bedroom. The first thing I noticed was how stiff my neck felt from sleeping in an awkward position. The second thing I noticed was that I didn't remember waking up, even once during the rest of the night. I made coffee and carried the mug into the living room. The cabin looked exactly as I'd left it, or almost. One of the dining chairs wasn't tucked beneath the table anymore. It sat at a slight angle, maybe 2 feet farther into the room. I stared at it while taking another sip of coffee. Did I leave that there? I honestly couldn't remember. Maybe I'd pulled it out while reading the note. Maybe I'd bumped it without noticing. It wasn't exactly supernatural for furniture to be out of place. Still, the image of another handwritten sentence surfaced before I wanted it to. If something has moved, put it back exactly where it was. I laughed quietly to myself. This place is getting in my head. Even so, I walked over, pushed the chair neatly beneath the table, and forgot about it. At least I tried to. The day was overcast for the first time since I'd arrived. The beach looked almost gray beneath the clouds. I drove into the small village for breakfast instead of cooking. There was only one cafe on the island, and half the customers seemed to know each other by name. An older waitress poured my coffee before I even ordered. "You must be staying the weekend. That obvious. You've still got that vacation look. What does that mean? You aren't checking your watch every 5 minutes." I smiled. Fair enough. While I ate, I overheard 2 fishermen talking in the next booth. "Water'll start dropping earlier today." "Yeah, you heading out?" "Nah, I'll be back before then." Neither of them sounded concerned. They spoke the way people back home talked about rain arriving before dinner. Normal. Routine. The tide was simply another part of life. After breakfast, I wandered through the marina again. I noticed something missing. The woman with the metal detector. Not the woman herself. The detector. Yesterday, I'd watched her walk back without it. This morning, I spotted the same bright blue jacket near the bait shop. She stood talking with another couple. No detector, no shovel, nothing. For some reason, curiosity got the better of me. I walked over. "Hey," I said, "you were out on the beach yesterday, right?" She looked at me for a second before smiling politely. "I was. I think I passed you. Probably. I noticed you weren't carrying your detector afterward." "Oh," she blinked. "I left it somewhere." "You couldn't find it again." "I honestly don't remember." She frowned slightly. Funny. The conversation ended there because someone called her name from across the parking lot. As she walked away, she rubbed her forehead like someone trying to remember a dream that kept slipping away. That bothered me more than I expected. Not because losing equipment was strange, because she genuinely looked confused about it. I spent another couple of hours reading on the beach. The weather stayed cool enough that I barely noticed time passing. Then I saw the ocean again. The waterline had begun creeping farther away. Not dramatically, just enough. The sentence from the note came back immediately. "Always head back before you notice the water pulling away." Without really thinking about it, I stood, dusted sand off my shorts, and headed toward the cabin. This time I didn't question why. Halfway there, I looked over my shoulder. The exposed beach stretched wider than it had an hour earlier. Dark patches of seaweed rested on wet sand that had been underwater moments before. Farther out, something caught my eye. Movement, a person maybe. Too far away to tell. I shaded my eyes. The figure didn't appear to be walking. It seemed to be standing perfectly still where the water had already retreated. I watched for several seconds. Then another person crossed between us, blocking my view. When they moved on, the distant figure was gone. I told myself they'd simply walked away while I wasn't looking. That explanation made enough sense. It had to. Back at the cabin, I made lunch and spent most of the afternoon inside because light rain had finally arrived. The sound of drops hitting the roof made the whole place feel even more isolated. I picked up the envelope again. This time I spread every page across the dining table. Some sheets clearly belonged together. Others didn't. One page looked newer than all the rest. The ink hadn't faded at all. Near the middle, I found another complete paragraph. "Don't try to read everything at once. I frowned. Below it, someone had crossed out 3 entire lines with thick black ink. The marker had soaked through both sides of the paper. Whatever had been written there was impossible to recover. My first instinct was to hold the page toward the window. Maybe sunlight would reveal something beneath the ink. Before I stood up, another sentence lower on the page caught my attention. If part of this note is missing, leave it that way. I leaned back in my chair. That's oddly specific. Curiosity nagged at me. The blacked out section bothered me more than I wanted to admit. I even considered using my phone flashlight to see through the paper. Instead, I folded the page exactly as I'd found it. The owner had either been eccentric or unusually committed to practical jokes. Either way, I wasn't going to spend my vacation trying to decode a welcome letter. By evening, the rain had stopped. The sky cleared just enough for streaks of orange to break through the clouds. I cooked an early dinner and watched the last light fade beyond the dunes. For the first time since arriving, I found myself wishing my phone had signal. Not because I was frightened, just because talking to someone for 5 minutes suddenly sounded nice. The cabin felt much quieter tonight, almost too quiet. I locked the front door before sunset finished fading. It wasn't something I consciously decided to do. My hand simply reached for the deadbolt on its own. Later, as I turned off the living room lamp, I remembered the line about counting the windows. I sighed. 5. I looked anyway. Living room, kitchen, bathroom, bedroom, 5. Satisfied, I headed toward bed. I had just switched off the bedroom light when I heard it, not knocking. A voice, soft, distant. Carried by the wind, it said my first name, once. Clear enough that there was no chance I'd imagined hearing words. I froze beside the bed. The voice came again. Gentle, patient, like someone outside didn't want to wake the neighbors. This time it sounded almost familiar. I couldn't place where I'd heard it before. I took one slow step toward the bedroom window. Then I stopped. Another sentence from the scattered pages surfaced before I reached the curtain. If you hear your name outside after dark. That was all I remembered reading. The rest of the sentence had been on another sheet. Outside, the voice spoke my name a third time. Closer now. Still calm. Still sounding like someone who knew exactly who they were looking for. I stood perfectly still with one hand resting on the bedroom doorframe. The voice had sounded close enough that, under any normal circumstance, I would have answered without thinking. It wasn't loud. It wasn't desperate. If anything, it carried the calm confidence of someone who expected me to respond. Hello almost slipped out before I caught myself. Instead, I swallowed the word and listened. My name came again, stretched slightly by the wind moving across the dunes. I knew that voice. Or at least I thought I did. It reminded me of my sister just enough to make my chest tighten. That made absolutely no sense. She was hundreds of miles away. My phone hadn't had service since yesterday afternoon. I stood there trying to convince myself my brain was connecting random sounds into familiar patterns. People heard voices in running water sometimes. Maybe this was no different. The silence that followed lasted nearly a minute. Then footsteps crunched softly across the gravel outside the bedroom wall. They weren't hurried. Whoever, or whatever, was out there moved with slow, measured steps, circling the cabin exactly the way the unseen visitor had the previous night. I resisted every urge to peek through the curtains. Eventually, the footsteps drifted toward the front porch. I heard one floorboard groan beneath steady weight. Then another. Then nothing. I don't remember when I finally fell asleep. I only remember waking to bright sunlight and realizing I was still fully dressed on top of the bed. My neck ached, and there was a half-empty glass of water on the nightstand that I didn't remember bringing into the bedroom. I carried it back to the kitchen, washed it, and tried not to overthink the previous night. I had come to relax. Instead, I was letting a strange welcome note and a few unexplained sounds occupy far too much space in my head. I decided fresh air would help. After breakfast, I walked into the village. The island looked completely ordinary again. A landscaping crew trimmed bushes near one of the larger houses. Someone washed a pickup truck in their driveway. Children chased each other with plastic buckets near the marina while their parents talked under a covered pavilion. The contrast almost embarrassed me. 12 hours earlier, I'd been standing motionless in a dark bedroom, afraid to answer a voice I couldn't explain. Now everything looked so normal that I wondered if I'd simply worked myself into unnecessary anxiety. At the general store, I picked up another bottle of water and a frozen sandwich. The teenage cashier recognized me immediately. "You surviving without cell service," she joked. Barely. Most people complain the first day. By the second day, they don't even check their phones anymore. Guess I'm getting there. She smiled, then glanced toward the windows. Heading to the beach. Probably after lunch. Just don't stay out too late. She said it casually while bagging my groceries, almost like reminding someone to wear sunscreen. Before I could respond, another customer stepped between us asking where to find batteries. The moment passed. I carried my lunch down to the shoreline and found the same driftwood log where I'd sat before. The tide was high again, waves rolling gently onto packed sand. I ate slowly while reading a few chapters from my book. Every now and then I looked up to watch pelicans skim low over the water. Hours slipped by. By mid-afternoon, the beach had become almost empty. Clouds drifted across the sun, cooling the air enough that I barely noticed the change until I happened to glance toward the shoreline. The water had begun pulling back again. This time I noticed it almost immediately. Without hesitation, I closed my book, stood, brushed sand from my shorts, and started walking toward the cabin. About halfway back, I noticed something that made me slow down. Fresh footprints crossed the dry sand roughly 30 yards ahead of me. I stopped. They began in the middle of an untouched stretch of beach. No tracks led to them from the dunes. No bicycle tires. No dog prints. Nothing. Just the first footprint pressed cleanly into dry sand as though someone had stepped out of empty air. They continued in a straight line toward the retreating ocean. I felt curiosity pulling me forward. Maybe I'd finally figure out the perfectly ordinary explanation I'd been looking for. I took one step, then another. I stopped again before reaching the first print. The sentence from the note returned so vividly, it was almost like hearing someone standing beside me. Never follow footprints that begin on dry sand. I let out a quiet breath and looked toward the water instead. The tracks disappeared over a low rise where the beach sloped gently downward. Whatever lay beyond it couldn't be seen from where I stood. For several long seconds I argued with myself. I wasn't superstitious. I didn't believe in cursed footprints or haunted beaches. At the same time, every strange thing that had happened since arriving seemed to point in one direction. None of the warnings had actually hurt me by following them. Ignoring one now simply because I wanted an explanation suddenly felt unnecessary. I turned around and walked back toward the cabin without looking behind me. I made it almost to the dunes before hearing another set of footsteps. Not ahead of me, behind me. They matched my pace almost perfectly. When I slowed, they slowed. When I resumed walking, they resumed a heartbeat later. I spun around. The beach behind me stretched empty in both directions. Wind pushed dry sand across the surface in thin ribbons. No people, no dogs. No birds close enough to make that sound. The footprints I'd refused to follow remained exactly where I'd left them. Nothing else moved. I waited another 10 seconds. Silence. Feeling slightly ridiculous, I continued toward the cabin. The footsteps returned after only a few yards. Soft, deliberate. Always just behind me. I refused to turn around again. Instead, I kept walking, climbing over the last dune until the cabin came into view. The moment my shoes left the sand and touched the weathered wooden steps leading to the porch, the footsteps stopped. Completely. I didn't hear another sound behind me. My pulse had quickened enough that I noticed my breathing. I unlocked the door, stepped inside, and closed it a little faster than usual. The cabin immediately felt warmer than outside familiar. Safe. I leaned against the closed door for a few seconds before laughing at myself. "You're letting this place mess with you," I said aloud. The words sounded less convincing than I'd hoped. I poured a glass of water and noticed something sitting on the kitchen counter. The brass key with the wooden tag labeled storage. I frowned. I was almost certain I'd left it beside the envelope on the dining table when I first arrived. Maybe I'd moved it yesterday while sorting the papers. I honestly couldn't remember. Another sentence surfaced in my mind. If something has moved, put it back exactly where it was. Without questioning it further, I picked up the key and returned it to its original spot beside the folded envelope. The instant I set it down, a single knock echoed from the front door. Just one. Quiet, patient, I didn't move. A second knock followed several seconds later. Then silence settled over the cabin once again. I stayed where I was with my hand still resting on the brass key. The second knock had been softer than the first, almost polite, as though whoever stood outside wasn't in any hurry. I looked toward the front door, but didn't take a step. After everything that had happened over the past 2 days, opening it no longer felt like the obvious thing to do. Another 30 seconds passed, no more knocking, no footsteps walking away. Just silence. The kind of silence that makes you notice your own breathing. I finally backed away from the table and forced myself to focus on something ordinary instead. I washed the glass I'd just used, wiped down the counter, and even straightened a dish towel that didn't need straightening. Anything to stop staring at the door. By the time darkness settled outside, I had almost convinced myself whoever had knocked had simply left. I heated a can of soup for dinner, ate half of it, and realized I wasn't actually hungry. My appetite had quietly disappeared sometime that afternoon. The folded pages lay untouched beside the key. I picked them up again, more out of frustration than curiosity. There had to be a complete version somewhere. Instead, every page seemed determined to answer one question, while creating two more. Near the back of the stack, I found a page I hadn't paid much attention to before, because it contained mostly crossed-out lines. Only one paragraph remained readable. The cabin is safer when everything stays where it belongs. If you notice something out of place, don't argue with yourself about whether you moved it. Put it back immediately. I looked around the room. The chair I'd pushed in that morning remained tucked neatly beneath the table. The key was back beside the envelope. Every cabinet door was closed. Everything appeared exactly as it should. That gave me enough peace of mind to put the papers away. Around 9:30, the wind picked up outside. The porch chair creaked once, then again. I turned off the living room lamp and began checking the windows before bed. It wasn't something I consciously decided to do anymore. It had simply become part of my routine. 2 in the living room, 1 above the sink, 1 in the bathroom. I walked into the bedroom. I stopped in the doorway. For several seconds, I couldn't understand why the room looked wrong. Then I realized what my eyes were trying to tell me. There were 2 windows. I blinked hard. One faced the ocean exactly where it had always been. The other sat farther along the same wall between the dresser and the closet. Same white trim, same curtains, same moonlight reflecting faintly against the glass. I stared without moving. No, I whispered. My first thought was embarrassingly simple. I had counted wrong every other night. I walked closer. I touched the frame of the first window. Solid wood. I touched the second. Same paint, same texture. I backed into the hallway and counted again from the beginning. Living room, 2. Kitchen, 1. Bathroom, 1. Bedroom, 2. 6. My stomach tightened. The sentence from the note came back word for word. If the number changes, don't try to figure out why. Then the part I'd almost laughed at earlier. Don't look through any extra window until sunrise. I slowly turned my head toward the unfamiliar window. The curtains weren't completely closed. A narrow gap, maybe an inch wide, revealed darkness beyond the glass. Curiosity hit me so hard it almost overpowered common sense. I only needed one quick look. Just enough to prove to myself there was a perfectly reasonable explanation. Maybe I'd somehow never noticed the second window. Maybe the room layout had confused me. I took one step forward. Then I stopped. Every strange thing I'd ignored so far had matched something written in the scattered pages. The tide, the knocking, the footprints, the voice. None of them had made sense when they happened. Neither did this. I forced myself to turn away from the unfamiliar window. My pulse hammered in my ears as I climbed into bed without looking back. I kept my eyes fixed on the opposite wall. Minutes passed. Then I heard it, a faint tapping against glass, not the window I knew, the other one. Tap, tap, tap. 3 slow taps. I squeezed my eyes shut. The tapping stopped. A few seconds later, my name drifted through the room. Quiet, gentle, close enough to sound as though someone stood just outside the glass. It wasn't my sister's voice this time. It sounded like my college friend, the one who had transferred the reservation to me. "Hey," the voice called softly. "Open up for a second." Every muscle in my body tensed. He couldn't possibly be there. He was supposed to be working all weekend back home. "Come on," the voice said again with a small laugh. "I know you're awake." I pulled the blanket higher, even though I immediately felt ridiculous for doing it. The tapping resumed. 3 taps. Then silence. Then my name again, calm, patient. Never louder than a normal conversation. It went on for what felt like an hour, though it was probably only 10 or 15 minutes. At some point, I realized something that chilled me more than the voice itself. It never once called from the direction of the front door. It always came from the window that hadn't existed yesterday. Eventually, exhaustion caught up with me. I don't remember falling asleep. I only remember opening my eyes to pale morning light. The first thing I did was look toward the wall beside the dresser. There was only one window in the bedroom. The second one was gone. I sat on the edge of the bed for nearly a minute before standing. I counted every window in the cabin again. 5. Exactly 5. I let out a shaky breath and almost laughed from relief. Maybe I dreamed the entire thing. That explanation lasted until I walked into the living room. The folded pages and the brass key were still on the dining table. Beside them lay something that hadn't been there when I went to bed. A small pile of damp sand. Pressed neatly into it was the unmistakable outline of a single bare human footprint, as if someone had stepped onto the table during the night and then vanished before taking a second step. I didn't touch the footprint. I just stood there staring at it, trying to convince myself there had to be some explanation I hadn't considered yet. Maybe sand had fallen out of my shoes. Maybe I'd somehow tracked it inside the day before. That argument lasted about 3 seconds. The print was too clean, too complete. One left footprint, no matching right one, no trail leading across the table, just a single wet impression pressed into the sand as though someone had deliberately left it there for me to find. I backed away until my legs bumped into the kitchen counter. My first instinct was to leave. I grabbed my phone even though I already knew it had no signal, then remembered the causeway. If the tide was low enough, I could be off the island within an hour. I didn't bother making breakfast. I threw clothes into my duffel bag as quickly as I could, zipped it shut, grabbed my keys, and reached for the folded note. My hand stopped halfway. The last page was sitting on top of the pile. I hadn't seen it before. Maybe it had always been there. Maybe I had missed it. I honestly couldn't say anymore. Across the top, in the same careful handwriting, was a single sentence. If you're reading this before you've left the island, stop. I almost laughed. My hands were shaking. No, I said to the empty cabin. I'm done. I folded the page without reading another word, left the entire envelope on the table, picked up my bag, and walked out the front door into bright morning sunlight. The island looked exactly as peaceful as it had the day I arrived. A man washed his boat at the marina. Someone pushed a stroller along the road. The woman who watered flowers smiled when I drove past and gave me the same small wave she'd given me 2 days earlier. If I hadn't spent the previous nights in that cabin, I would have believed nothing unusual had ever happened there. I reached the causeway in less than 10 minutes. A county truck was parked near the entrance while 2 workers replaced a weathered sign. One of them stepped into the road and held up a hand for me to stop. "Give us just a minute," he called. I rolled down my window. "No problem." He carried the old wooden sign to the back of the truck while another worker bolted a fresh one into place. It was almost identical except for new paint and brighter lettering. Beneath the island's name was a smaller line I'd somehow never noticed before. "Check the tide before crossing." The worker waved me through with a smile. "You're good." I thanked him and drove onto the causeway without looking back. The moment my tires reached the mainland, my phone buzzed so violently I nearly dropped it. 7 missed texts. 4 missed calls. 3 emails. Every notification arrived at once. The oldest message was from my sister asking if I'd made it safely. The newest was from my college friend. "Hey, just checking in. Hope you're enjoying the cabin. By the way, did you ever mention whether you found the handwritten note?" I didn't answer right away. I kept driving until I found a gas station about 20 miles inland. While the tank filled, I finally replied, "Yeah, weirdest welcome packet I've ever seen." His response came almost immediately. "That's strange." Then another message appeared. "When I stayed there last year, there wasn't any note." I read it 3 times. I even scrolled up to make sure he was talking about the same cabin. He was. I never answered after that. A few weeks passed before I stopped thinking about the island every day. Life slowly returned to normal. Work piled up. My weekends became busy again. The cabin faded into the category of experiences I couldn't fully explain but no longer wanted to examine too closely. Then one evening my sister came over for dinner. We were sitting at the kitchen table looking through another box of old family photos when she stopped in the middle of a sentence. "Did you buy a new key?" she asked. "What key?" She pointed toward the counter behind me. I turned around. Resting beside the coffee maker was a brass key attached to a worn wooden tag. Burned into the wood was one word: storage. I knew with complete certainty I had left that key on the dining table inside the cabin. I walked over and picked it up. The wood felt damp, carrying the faint smell of salt water. Tied beneath the tag with faded string was a folded piece of paper I had never seen before. My sister asked what it said. I told her it was probably just an old receipt and slipped it into my pocket without opening it. I haven't unfolded it, not once. Maybe it's another page from the note. Maybe it explains everything that happened. Or maybe it explains something worse. Every few months, usually after a storm rolls through, I wake up in the middle of the night because I think I've heard 3 slow knocks somewhere outside my house. I never check. I never answer when someone calls my name from the yard after dark, no matter how familiar the voice sounds. And before I go to bed, every single night, I count the windows in my house. They're still the same today. At least they were the last time I counted.